Hi everybody, this is Kat Vlies from Central New Mexico Community College. I'd like to go over the classification system of neurons here with the help of a little chart I have created at the bottom here, and then more importantly with a diagram that I'll draw here in just a little bit. But let's review the fact that neurons can be classified according to function and structure. So if we focus on function, we have three types of neurons. We have sensory neurons, interneurons or association neurons as they're also called, and motor neurons. If we focus for a moment on the sensory neurons, then remember what they do. They sense the environment, meaning they are the neurons responsible for picking up stimuli. And a stimulus is any change in the environment, whether that environment is the external environment or your internal environment. For instance, an external stimulus could be a bug landing on your skin and biting you, or walking on your skin. An internal stimulus could be food arriving in your stomach, and that stretches stretch receptors, and sensory neurons will respond to that. So sensory neurons, they carry the action potentials from the body to the CNS. Interneurons or association neurons, on the other hand, are only found inside of the CNS, and their goal is to interconnect various neurons. They interconnect with one another, or they interconnect sensory neurons with motor neurons. And then finally, your motor neurons, they're the ones that carry information from the CNS to all of your effectors. And when we say effectors, that means all of your muscles, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, as well as skeletal muscles. Even the glands are included in the effectors. So your motor neurons carry the commands that your brain and spinal cord come up with in the form of action potentials to these effectors. But as I said, we can also look at the neurons in a totally different way, and we can look at how many processes actually arise from the cell body. And when we say processes, we mean axons and dendrites together. So processes mean axons and dendrites. The most common type of neuron is going to be multipolar, meaning that many processes start out or arise from the cell body. Unipolar neurons, on the other hand, are kind of strange looking, as you'll see in just a moment, but they have just one process that leaves the cell, one major process that eventually splits, however, as you'll see. And then bipolar neurons are actually quite rare, and they are neurons with two major processes, and we tend to find them a lot in the retina of the eye and inside of the nose in what we call the olfactory epithelium. So allow me to make a drawing now that sort of summarizes these different classification systems together with how these neurons relate to one another. So what I want to do is first draw a sensory neuron with its little dendrites here, and what we see is a typical sensory neuron is going to be unipolar. And here I'm drawing a typical unipolar neuron. Its axonal terminals will be located inside of the CNS. So what I'm going to do now is indicate where the CNS is located. Let me do that with white. So here the axonal terminals are located inside of the CNS. Let's make all of this the CNS right here. And the CNS, of course, includes the brain and spinal cord. CNS for brain and spinal cord. These sensory neurons that are unipolar tend to be pretty heavily myelinated. That's not to say that some of the sensory neurons are shorter and are not as heavily myelinated. But I'm drawing a sensory neuron that actually starts in the skin. So how about I use blue to represent that. For instance, we're looking here at the skin, and these little dendrites that we see here are wrapped around a hair follicle. Let's pretend that that's what we're looking at. And so you could pretend that these dendrites represent the root hair plexus that we see around the root of a hair follicle. I'm trying to talk and write at the same time. A little challenging. So do we consider these to be dendrites, and do we consider this then to be an axon? Yes, I would say so. Because we see that the action potential is going to be arising here. This is where your action potential is going to start. And it'll then propagate towards the central nervous system. So imagine that a bug is crawling on your arm. That bug is going to move the hair follicles, and in response to that, in response to the mechanical stimulus, mechanical meaning the moving of the hair follicles, ion gates will start to open in these dendrites, creating a change in the resting membrane potential, a graded potential therefore, or many graded potentials. So let me use green to indicate where we find our graded potentials. They occur here. And so eventually these graded potentials will summate such that they can trigger an action potential, as I've already indicated. So this is your typical sensory neuron, which happens to also be unipolar. Notice that its axonal terminals, however, are inside of the CNS. Its cell body is located right here, CB for cell body, and as you know, these are the axonal terminals. So if you focus for a moment on just the cell body, notice that there's really only one major process arising from the cell body, and that's why we call this a unipolar neuron. Now, this particular sensory neuron typically will be synapsing with many interneurons, or at least one. And I'm going to be keeping things a bit simple here. So I'm going to draw a couple of interneurons perhaps. And many of our interneurons are actually multipolar. So right here we see the cell body of our interneuron with its little dendrites, and here we see the axon. And the axon might or might not be myelinated. It depends on what distance that axon needs to cover. In the spinal cord, we may see many axons myelinated, as they need to carry information from perhaps the most inferior portion of the spinal cord all the way into the brain. So our action potential is eventually going to be firing here on our interneuron as neurotransmitters are being passed on from the sensory neurons onto the interneuron. So let me draw another interneuron that synapses with this interneuron perhaps. I'm going to keep it a bit small because I'm beginning to run out of space. So here is your other interneuron. And this one then, in its turn, might synapse with a motor neuron. And notice that the cell body of our motor neuron is going to be having many dendrites, and that already tells you that we're going to be dealing here with a multipolar neuron. So here is our typical somatic motor neuron, meaning I'm drawing the kind of neuron that's going to go to skeletal muscle. Okay, so its destination here is skeletal muscle. It's going to release, therefore, acetylcholine onto the skeletal muscle such that, or skeletal muscle cells, such that the skeletal muscle cells themselves can fire an action potential that will then eventually lead to the contraction of the muscle. Now, your somatic motor neurons, because they're quite long, are always going to be heavily myelinated. I forgot to label these guys as interneurons. Okay, so we're going to see lots of myelination, and remember, the myelination that we see in the peripheral nervous system is the myelination that is created by Schwann cells. So what I drew on the sensory neuron, those are also Schwann cells. The myelination inside of the CNS, so if we have myelinated interneurons, that myelination is formed by another neuroglial cell, and those are called oligodendrocytes. So if we continue to indicate the direction in which the action potential travels, and assuming that we need to have graded potentials at the dendrites, of course, then we get to this point. And remember, inside of our skeletal muscle, we're also going to have action potentials. I neglected to draw some dots to indicate that here neurotransmitters are released as well. So let's review this now. We see that our somatic motor neuron is multipolar. We see that our interneurons are typically multipolar, although they can take on all kinds of bizarre forms. But the majority of them will be multipolar. And then, as we already discussed, your sensory neurons are unipolar. I need for you to remember that the cell bodies of the sensory neurons are outside of the CNS, but their axonal terminals are inside. Interneurons are completely embedded inside of the CNS, and their function is to be sitting, in between the sensory and motor neurons. Remember, interneuron, inter means in between, and that's also why they're called association neurons. They associate sensory neurons with motor neurons at some level or another. And then we have our typical somatic motor neuron going to skeletal muscle. That is also going to be multipolar. With time, you're going to see that autonomic motor neurons look similar to this, except you're always going to see, I may as well draw this, I guess, that in the case of autonomic motor neurons, we're going to see two neurons in a row. You'll learn about that eventually towards the end of the semester. And so typically you have two multipolar neurons in a row, and their effectors, of course, are going to be the heart, smooth muscle, and glands, basically all of the other effectors. And like I said, they're going to have different levels of myelination depending on how long they are. And of course, inside of the CNS, they're going to be synapsing with an interneuron, or possibly synapsing directly with a sensory neuron. So this is one more thing I'd like to address, and that is the fact that a sensory neuron in the CNS, right here at the level of these axonal terminals here may synapse directly with a motor neuron without the help of any interneurons, and obviously that allows for a very fast response in the body. If an action potential starts here in a sensory neuron and is immediately passed on to a somatic motor neuron, clearly our skeletal muscles can respond very quickly, and this is the kind of neural pathway you might see in spinal reflexes especially. So I hope this clarifies to you the difference between sensory neurons, interneurons, and motor neurons, and the difference between functional neurons and structural neurons. The absolute final thing I wanted to wrap up with here is to come back to the example I started out with here in the very beginning, where a bug is crawling on your skin, which of course is going to open up those ion gates, as I said, on the dendrites of the root hair plexus. Graded potential, summate action potential starts to propagate. And then the action potential is passed on, as I explained here, and eventually makes it to the skeletal muscles. Skeletal muscles contract, and that is what allows you to smack the bug and therefore stop the stimulus. So I hope that clarifies things for you. Thanks for listening, you guys. I really hope this helped you.